English translation. 655th contact Thursday, the 30th of June 2016, 13:57 hours.
There you are, Ptaah. Greetings and welcome, dear friend.
Greetings to you too, dear friend Edward, and thanks for your welcome. Unfortunately, it is not possible for me to come to the correction next Saturday, so Anjana or Florina will take over this work. And today I come especially because Florina reported to me last night that during your respective correction, work on Wednesday it is repeatedly encountered that in Guidu's book manuscript, a great deal is presented incompletely and confusingly. In terms of inadequate physical explanations, as we both also found.
Correct. The explanations and so-called explanations are so deficient and even misleading that we have decided not to correct these things any further and to take them out of the book. For lay people who have nothing whatsoever to do with physics, the whole thing is simply frustrating. And this is also the case when I explain to the correcting participants what is to be understood by the physics jargon, whereby I am also helped by Yuli and Patrick, who have also learned some physics. We have talked about this on several occasions, and I have also removed some of it from the manuscript. But there are still some things that simply do not belong in the book, and are not understood by lay people with regard to physics. That's why we want to take it out, in order to give the readers something that they can understand and comprehend, but which is also effectively related to the spiritual teaching, the mission, its facts, circumstances and contexts, and so on.
I can understand that. And indeed, since our last conversation regarding this matter, I have often thought about the whole thing and have had doubts as to whether we should not remove various things from the manuscript. On the one hand, for the reasons you mention, but on the other hand also because it is not in connection with what must be the actual content of the book. I wanted to talk to you about this again. But unfortunately, other things and facts were brought up again and again, which seemed to be of importance, and which made us forget the whole thing of the Guidu book. Therefore, I am glad that it happened again in your proofreading group that the whole sorry thing was brought up again, and that you called Florina to inform me. After which I am now here, and we will work through everything another time and weed out from the manuscript what is unnecessary, incomprehensible to lay people, and confusing. Then let's start right away, because as usual this work will take some time. And I see you have a printout of the work here, which will make our work much easier.
Yes, Bernadette has hurried to print out all but 3 parts. She beamed the missing 3 parts to me on the computer. Consequently, we have to look at them on the screen just now.
That is good. Let's get right to work then. First, we will take the printed pages here because it is easier to work with these than with what you say is in the computer. We finished it faster than I thought. Printing the work out helped a lot and saved us time?
Yes, it was a very quick hour and a half, though, because the time just flew by.
When you're just busy?
Yes, that is so, because you do not look at the time flowing between your fingers when you are doing a job with interest and joy. If you were lazing around joylessly, then an hour and a half would seem like 5 or even more hours. But if you do not have to leave yet, I would be happy if we could still openly or privately.
We can do that, of course.
Good, because I am feeling a bit sick to my stomach about the Brexit. Then that's cleared up as well. It was about 10 years ago when you told me that the EU dictatorship would secretly start negotiations with Canada regarding a trade agreement, which would be damaging in terms of state welfare services for the populations, but also for the already weak democratic efforts in environmental protection of the EU dictatorship countries. You talked about CETA, as is also the case publicly today. Can you please say openly what exactly is behind CETA? Because you said at the time that it would be devious and widely damaging agreements between the EU dictatorship and Canada for the populations of Europe. 1.
First of all, I have to explain another time that we have to effectively and repeatedly point out with regard to the EU that it is a dictatorship, and that this fact has to be mentioned again and again because very many EU supporters in Switzerland and in the EU dictatorship itself, in their clueless way of thinking and inability to judge, do not recognize and also cannot grasp the reality and its truth. The fact is that the EU Dictatorship Commission, as I predicted to you in 1996, has been negotiating in strict secrecy with Canada from 2009 onwards on a trade and investment protection agreement called CETA, respectively, Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. 2. As a dictatorship, the EU naturally excluded the public from the whole thing, as well as all the parliaments of the EU dictatorship countries. However, since lobbying has gained great might in many countries of the earth for many years, economic lobbyists also gained massive influence on the text of the agreement, which was only made public years later in 2014, after the negotiations had been concluded. However, what will actually develop from this, and in a very negative way, is being wisely concealed, because anything detrimental will take similar forms to the TTIP agreement between the USA and the EU dictatorship. Predictable and foreseeable is the fact that with CETA, a massive dismantling of the otherwise already weak democracies in the EU dictatorship countries will take place, as well as in the public provision of life and welfare. But also the environmental protection will be more and more neglected and through omitted controls and bans. Regarding toxic substances in food, every population of the EU dictatorship countries will be harmed in terms of health, etc.
Look here. To my question and your answer, I tried to do some research on the internet and found the following.
Attack Deutschland. CETA is the first EU trade deal to provide for private arbitration. Companies can sue the contracting states before tribunals if they see their future profit expectations restricted by legislation. This means that the states will have to face billions in lawsuits. At the same time, the scope for legislation in favor of the common good will be considerably restricted. The main beneficiaries will be transnational corporations. Many of the largest U.S. companies have branches in Canada. Through CETA, they would be able to sue EU states even if the TTIP agreement between the US and the EU fails. CETA will be binding under international law and almost impossible to withdraw. The infamous zombie clause in Chapter 34 even provides for investors' rights to sue to be preserved for another 20 years in the unlikely event of CETA's dissolution. Moreover, CETA is designed as a living agreement. A regulatory council of non-elected bureaucrats is supposed to review proposed legislation to see if it could affect trade interests. This opens the door for business lobbyists to withdraw unwelcome draft laws from circulation, even before parliaments and the public learn about them. Even a subsequent change or extension of the treaty without democratic control is possible. Privatization and undermining of public services. Unlike most previous trade agreements, CETA does not list the areas to be liberalized, but only the exceptions negative list. This leaves an indeterminately wide field open to the compulsion of privatization and deregulation. Once deregulated and privatized areas may no longer be withdrawn standstill and ratchet clauses. CETA does not provide for a clear, fundamental exemption of public services from liberalization. Furthermore, CETA calls into question ecological and social award criteria in public procurement, and thus a central element in local self-government. Social and labor standards are also threatened with erosion by CETA. Under CETA, foreign investors could even sue against new taxes and levies, such as a wealth tax. Public funding for cultural institutions is also at risk. Door opener for genetic engineering, fracking, and dirty tar sands. CETA undermines existing environmental standards and restricts future environmental legislation. The EU's ban on imports of extremely climate-damaging crude oil from Canadian tar sands, for example, was already softened in the course of the CETA negotiations. Under CETA, companies could also sue against a possible future ban on shale gas extraction fracking. Fracking is suspected of poisoning groundwater with chemicals and even causing earthquakes. Canada has already been sued under the CETA-like NAFTA agreement after the province of Quebec stopped fracking. CETA replaces the precautionary principle that applies in the EU with one that is supposed to be science-based. According to this principle, potentially dangerous products and technologies can only be withdrawn from circulation once their harmfulness has been proven beyond doubt, and thus often far too late. In this way, genetic engineering can come back onto our table through the back door. Stop CETA, TTIP, and TISA. CETA is due to be ratified before the end of 2016. Help defend democracy, the common good, and the environment against this corporate coup d'etat. Asterisk. Demand accountability from your MEPs in the EU Parliament. Asterisk. CETA is considered a mixed agreement that also needs to be ratified by the Bundestag and Bundesrat. Put pressure on your MPs in the Bundestag and state parliaments. There are 5 state elections in 2016.
These are indisputable facts.
I think so too, but the whole thing goes even further, because you also told me at that time it was summer. During a private conversation, on the other hand, that the EU dictatorship was secretly also working on finding and building up ways to first only have an indirect say in its lust for power, but was already planning to intervene in the course of time also in the direct government business and decisions etc. of the EU dictatorship states. Can you say something more about this, please?
In fact, for some time now, plans have been secretly made and worked out among the powerful of the EU dictatorship, which tend to intervene, first indirectly but then directly in the parliaments of all EU dictatorship states. The hitherto still secret plan corresponds firstly to the purpose of an insidious intervention in the parliaments of the individual EU member states, namely in such a way that all state business to be decided is passed in accordance with the forms of the EU dictatorship. Secondly, it is already stated in the secret plans that from this first measure the second is to emerge and is to be aimed at orienting the entire governmental systems of all EU member states to the absolutely authoritarian, repressive and totalitarian EU forms of dictatorship, whereby all states affiliated to the EU dictatorship are to lose their sovereignty. In this way, if the EU dictatorship can assert itself, the absolute subjugation of the governments of all EU member states to the direct EU dictatorship power in Brussels is planned as the final consequence, as a result of which no EU member state will exist independently anymore. As a result, all states which have joined the EU dictatorship and which it can realize according to its secret plans will become satellite states or vassal states, and thus small states which are in a relationship of dependence to the totalitarian EU dictatorship, and will be absolutely bound into its suzerainty without being able to free themselves from it. And if it comes to pass that the whole of this secret plan is realized, then the EU dictatorship will form itself into an absolutely European-dominating and militarily world-threatening great power. So all EU dictatorship states would only be formally independent and politically directly subjugated by the suzerain and totalitarian EU dictatorship. And if the EU dictatorship powers succeed in these deceitful, nefarious, and underhanded plots and deviousness, then all EU dictatorship member states will ultimately effectively only be sham states with sham governments, which will be directly subjugated by the EU dictatorship powers in Brussels, and then only have to do what they are ordered to do. In the process, the EU dictatorship will then imperiously no longer tolerate any contradiction, and the dictatorial government and administrative measures will lie unrestrictedly with the EU dictatorship supremacy.
The whole thing looks bleak, especially also because there are too many stupidly stupid EU supporters in every country shouting pro and hooray and doing everything to stuff the criminal and even criminal collar of the EU dictatorship. And when I consider that reasonable human beings of the EU countries cannot agree with anything and will demonstrate because of it, I dread the fact that the EU dictatorship has reintroduced the death penalty and allows protesters to be simply gunned down or sentenced to death.
That is indeed very worrying.
Exactly. Now England has said goodbye to the EU dictatorship. But the way I see it, on the one hand, the Scots and about 48% of the English are crazy and pathologically stupid for continuing to flirt with the EU dictatorship and wanting to be enslaved by it. On the other hand, the EU dictatorship henchmen, first and foremost the power-hungry and unrealistic German Chancellor Merkel. Juncker and Schulz are now trying to terrorize Britain into leaving the dictatorship as quickly as possible. And as I see it, the whole agitation against England by the criminal EU dictators Juncker and Schulz, etc., as well as the EU dictator Merkel, is now being carried out of sheer hatred and mindless revenge in order to punish England and drive it into misery. And there is also the insidious thought that England will sooner or later enter the EU dictatorship again through another and repeated vote, as the sick fools of Scotland also want to do, which is why they want to secede from England and become independent. And what is further to be said is based on the fact that when speeches are made in the Bundestag in Germany, neither Angela Merkel nor her fellow campaigners care what their opponents correctly and truthfully say in their speeches. I have often observed on television that the unrealistic Chancellor and her followers only grin stupidly and maliciously, chat with their like-minded people or read newspapers, etc. Thus, the sensible ones who are thoughtfully acquainted with the effective facts and also state them, like, for example, Sarah Wagenknecht, born in 1969, who works as a German economist, publicist, and politician, have no chance of getting through to the power-obsessed and achieving anything of value politically.
It is absolutely unquestionable and undoubted that everything is indeed as you say, whereby you single out the politician Sarah Wagenknecht of the right, because this woman sees the effective facts correctly in every respect and also stands up for them courageously in every respect. For this, however, she is being insulted and ridiculed as a result of the stupidity of the unrealistic and power-obsessed Merkel and her vassals, who are enthralled to her by the Merkel supporters distorting and misrepresenting the effective facts in order to irritate many and draw them to their side. But also those Scots you are talking about are really stupid regarding the truth about the EU and are neither able to recognize nor to understand how dictatorially dangerous and insidious the EU dictatorship really is. With regard to the EU itself, the dictatorially powerful are unable to cope with the fact that the majority of the English population has recognized the European Union as a dictatorship and voted to leave it. In fact, nothing better could be done, and this could possibly also be the beginning for the populations of other states that have joined the EU dictatorship to free themselves from it again, especially if prudent rulers of these states take the necessary steps to break with the EU dictatorship. The fact of the matter is also that large parts of the population of various EU dictatorship countries have been regretting their EU membership for some time and would like to leave the dictatorship again. But unfortunately, this is prevented by stupid people among the population, as well as by the power-obsessed rulers.
Maybe there will come a time when bad advice will cause the whole EU dictatorship to go down the drain and all its stupid-headed supporters and backers will bite their own asses in anger. But let's leave that for another time, because I would like to address something that we have also recently communicated about again. So, your daughter Simya Se, Quetzal and I have often talked during our contact time since 1975 about the fact that a human being should not be approached and attacked by psychologists or any other human beings with calming, well-intentioned, comforting, and sympathetic conversations and words when he has had a shock and horror experience experience that interferes with his thoughts, feelings, and psyche. Such shock and fright experiences and excitations, as I learned from your father Svath when I was still a boy and he explained and urged me just as much as you, Quetzal and your daughter Simyase only bring harm instead of benefit in the state of shock experience, fright experience, and the resulting excitation. Consequently, I have always acted in accordance with what I have learnt from all of you when situations have come to me which have required me to talk to human beings when they have suffered shock. horror or grief, suffering, misery, and distress. So I never tried to give consolation, etc., but only ever talked to such human beings about useful things that had to be done, or if it was already necessary to speak. Then I always did so in such a way that the shocking and frightening experiential experience was not addressed, or if it was not otherwise possible, only in a trivial way. And in this way I acted in accordance with what Svath taught me, as you have also done. And because the thought-feeling psychic world of the human being suffers a shock or even a trauma in the state of a frightening experience excitement, which must be counteracted. And this can only be done by leaving the human being alone with regard to the shock, horror, or trauma afflicting him, his suffering and grief, but, if necessary, addressing him with neutral conversation. And as I have learned from Svath and you, a human being who has suffered a shock or terror, or who has fallen into mourning, should not be confronted with what is tormenting him or her for at least 2 days, so that he or she can process and come to terms with what has happened in silence and alone. Depending on the human being and his or her mental, emotional, psychological consciousness condition, the first acute phase of shock, suffering, misery, inner distress, and grief will have subsided after 2 days at the earliest. So that, if necessary, a helpful conversation can be held, which will then no longer lead to memories of agitation or over-ordering. Furthermore, it is also the case that, depending on the human being, his or her capacity for thought, feeling, psyche, consciousness, and also the state of the ratio, precisely in relation to understanding and reason, determine how long the complete regeneration takes in relation to the liberation of thoughts and feelings, and the suffering of the psyche up to its renormalization. The fact is, however, that when a human being finds himself in such a situation, in a shocking and terrifying experience excitement, he should be left alone and not be pelted with words of comfort, etc. And this should not be done because every human being, on the one hand, reacts in a completely contrary way to words of comfort, etc. directed at him, according to his ratio, which has been affected by shock, fright, or trauma, and also according to his mental, emotional, psychemical constitution, but on the other hand, he can also be attacked by thoughts of guilt and unease. This, however, makes everything much worse and plunges the human being into suffering and mourning, as well as into a psycho-emotional distress that deepens the more the human being is talked into it. This is exactly how many psychologists and psychotherapists, so-called clergy and compassionate people, who think they know better, work, because they do not understand anything about the human thought-feeling psychological world, and in their narrow-mindedness cause immense suffering and immense thought-feeling psychological damage to human beings who are in shock, horror, and trauma. For example, as a result of an accident, misfortune or death, etc., they involve the victims of suffering and terror in stupid, pathologically silly, helpful, and comforting conversations, and thus make them even more the victims of suffering, grief, and terror. In the process, they, the very victims, are encouraged and made to give free rein to their sorrowful, miserable, shocking, terrifying, and sad thoughts, feelings, and profound emotional impulses through idiotic conversations and ways of speaking. Because this is supposed to help them to process and cope with what they have experienced in a sorrowful, shocking, and sad way. This, however, is complete nonsense and only increases the suffering, the inner distress and misery, the shock, the horror, and the grief, because everything is blown out of proportion and memories of excitement or over-ordering arise and make everything even worse. And it is also a fact that every human being who falls into a situation of shock, horror, or grief, etc., has to act according to his or her own rational capacity and his or her thought, feeling, psyche, consciousness, façon, and takes different lengths of time to process the whole thing.
Whoever doubts your explanations is incapable of understanding and reason. For word of your exposition corresponds to the fact, as you have learned it from my father, my daughter, and also from Quetzal and me. And as I know, you already acted according to my father's instruction in this respect in your boyhood and youth, as you have since then also in your further life, through which you were able to be helpful to many human beings on earth.
To help honestly and in the correct way has always been a pleasure to me. But tell me, my friend, what do you think of my thoughts that for economic and other reasons of prosperity, so-called economic refugees should never be offered a hand? Consequently, they should also not be recognized as refugees in the right of asylum. If it is only a matter of being able to lead a prosperous life in a better-off country, it cannot and must not be a human right to flee one's homeland. But a flight can effectively only be when compelling life-threatening reasons and circumstances justify a flight from one's homeland. In this context, what is effectively meant is a cowardly flight from one's ancestral homeland, but not a correct and lawfully officially approved and executed emigration, a transfer or resettlement to another country with all the necessary identity papers, etc., in order to pursue regular work in another country, to lead a righteous life and to assimilate into the local customs, language, and civic duties. The human rights situation allows this in practically all countries for every upright human being who is not persecuted in his home country as a result of criminal or criminal acts and deeds, and who also fulfills his civic duties. This does not apply to work shirkers, criminals, terrorists, criminals, and effective economic refugees who are not welcome anywhere. As a rule, a human being who emigrates for reasons of rights is not a refugee from his homeland, because only a human being who has to flee from his homeland because of unjustified persecution or because of a real threat to his life or danger to his life and has to seek asylum and protection in another state offering him freedom for the sake of his life, is considered an effective refugee. Basically, a distinction must be made between real refugees and so-called pseudo-refugees, such as poverty refugees who flee their homeland because of their poverty, which very often also has political reasons, which, however, does not justify flight, as well as the pure profit refugees, economic refugees, and prosperity refugees who only want to profit from the prosperity of other countries and live in joys and glory, often at the expense of the working population of the prosperous countries. This alone is proven by the fact that such refugees are supported by the state in the countries of refuge with immense funds, expensive accommodation and materials, etc., while the poor among their own population have to live miserably below the subsistence level and receive much less in terms of state care and protection than the real and fake refugees. But then there are also the criminal refugees who only flee from their home countries in order to escape to wealthy states and to be active in these in many ways, such as through fraud, theft, burglary, drug trafficking, criminal or even criminal through murder and manslaughter. This, while others like terrorist fugitives only flee to other and for them hostile wealthy countries to wait there as sleepers to be able to carry out deadly and destructive acts of terror. And all this harms the effectively genuine refugees who, for example, have to flee their homeland because they are persecuted on the basis of gender, ethnicity, women, opinion, politics, religion, state or sexual orientation, such as bisexuality or homosexuality, or threatened with torture or the death penalty, which, among other things, correspond to effectively legitimate refugee definitions or reasons for fleeing. The distinction between real and false refugees is extremely problematic, because it is very often difficult to define what kind of refugees we are dealing with, because many of them lose or destroy their identity papers in order to conceal their origin and many other things that could be harmful to them in an asylum application. There are certainly many reasons why many human beings flee their homes, such as civil war, armed conflict, war, climate change, natural disasters such as droughts, floods, tsunamis, or violent volcanic eruptions, etc., as well as private violence, slavery, and persecution. But also serious official, state or criminal organizational human rights violations, structural violence, all kinds of man-made catastrophes, such as a worst-case scenario or super-GAU at nuclear power plants, as well as landslides, dam failures, and massive fires, etc., can be reasons for many human beings to flee. So it really is possible that human beings have to leave their homeland involuntarily, but then it has to be said that fleeing is a right for them, and that they are effectively real refugees. Apart from that, there are also very many human beings who have to leave their home country and go to wealthy countries because they cannot find a way to feed their family and offer them a safe home in their home country. However, these human beings do not flee their homeland, but take the right and correct path to foreign countries with all the necessary official permits as righteous foreign workers, without sneaking into wealthy states as refugees and depending on the welfare of their populations. I can have great respect for these human beings, for all honest foreign workers such as sons and fathers of families who cannot feed their parents or own families in their home country and therefore set out for a foreign country to earn a living for themselves, their parents and siblings, or for their own family or wife and children with all the necessary permits. Of course, every human being has the right to life, liberty, peace, and security. This is indisputable, as it is also written in Universal Declaration of Human Rights Art. 3. But these values are also connected with honesty, honor, righteousness, and dignity, which must be granted to the real and true refugees and foreign workers, but not to any law-breaking, bogus refugee, no matter what kind. If human beings flee their homeland because their human rights have been and are being violated, then fleeing is a right, but the law must be respected in every respect. That is to say, nothing criminal. Otherwise, unjust or even criminal may be associated with it. And this also includes being able to prove one's identity with valid identity papers. Furthermore, it must be said that work-shy, criminal elements exist in all states of the world, and many of them, such as bogus refugees, etc., sense an opportunity in other and wealthy countries to enrich themselves unlawfully through the population and the state in question, or to be able to be supported financially. In fact, there are no so-called safe crisis countries from which pseudo-refugees of various kinds cannot flee and take refuge in effectively safe and prosperous European states and sneak into them. And it must be made clear once again that there is no country of origin of refugees on earth from which only genuine righteous refugees come. Even in countries with massive human rights violations, there are of course genuine, honest and dignified human beings who, if they have to flee their homeland for the sake of their security of life, are also helpfully taken in by various states in Europe. But with such righteous refugees, especially with refugee flows such as those for which the irresponsible German Chancellor Angela Merkel is responsible, there are inevitably also work-shy, criminal, terrorist, and criminal elements mixed in. This woman, who is irresponsibility itself, suffers from non-reality naivety and is therefore incapable of perceiving effective reality and its truth. Consequently, she is neither able to recognize reality nor to judge it, because she is precisely incapable of judgment, but unconscionably obsessed with power. In this way, it unhesitatingly violates existing laws without being stopped by its equally power-hungry and obedient, irresponsible co-exercisers of power. In this way, it has unrestrainedly brought into being the problematic and disastrous streams of refugees from Africa, the Orient and Asia, and can continue to do so, which will have dire consequences for the EU dictatorship states, and also for Switzerland if the actions and deeds of these delusional people are not finally stopped. So if the even greater problems that are brewing in this regard are not quickly counteracted and the criminal machinations of the German power-obsessed chancellor are not stopped, then very bad things will result. On the one hand, this person, who is incapable of governing, would have to be taken out of circulation. And on the other hand, the nonsense of the Schengen treaties would also have to be repealed and declared null and void. And this would have to happen in relation to the fact that the open borders in all European states would have to be closed again immediately and secured with effective border controls with regard to all entrants. If this is not done, the result of the whole refugee mishap is that, since the beginning of the refugee flows, more and more Islamist terrorists, suicide bombers, and paramilitary groups have been infiltrating the whole of Europe, carrying out mass murders and wreaking havoc. For some time now, due to Merkel's idiotic and imbecilic policy of welcoming refugees and endangering security, a clandestine Islamist scene according to IS or Islamist State and Al-Qaeda, etc., has developed in the underground of Europe, whereby it is even questionable whether the police forces and the secret services are at all oriented in this regard, and also know that they can no longer control them. But that's not all, because since Merkel's mania for welcoming refugees has begun to take hold in Africa, Asia and Arabia, various criminal gangs have also crept into the whole of Europe, unrecognized so far, which will also ply their evil trade in the future, as will be the case more and more with criminal gangs and individual perpetrators of purely European origin. And it is also to be said that the individual criminal gangs and terrorist and paramilitary groups are centralizing in the European states and, through suggestive influence, are finding more and more supporters among the populations and radicalizing them.
With this, you are revealing what you and I discuss again and again in private conversations, namely also what is really dangerous in Europe, namely the fact that for some time now, a new threat has been building up in all European states, which also affects Switzerland, namely as a result of the expanding right-wing extremism as well as in relation to the paramilitary scene, Islamist terrorism and terrorism with other groups. In this respect, the whole thing has been spreading secretly for some time, because according to our investigations and observations, the fact is that a very anarchistic, paramilitary, radical extremist and terrorist threat is developing on the European continent as a whole, which is only poorly recognized or not recognized at all by the secret services and security authorities. And this is also because the secret services and security authorities do not pay attention to the truth in this respect, or do so only extremely inadequately, are too unconcerned and, moreover, naive, as you call such behavior. Effectively, these authorities, the secret services and security agencies and the governments, should be as concerned as they are about very precise investigations of all scenes that violate the order and security of the populations and the states. The fact is, as our investigations and observations clearly show, that right-wing extremist and terrorist, religious sectarian degenerations and hate-laden attitudes are spreading throughout Europe and in all European states, and Switzerland is no exception, mainly in smaller and larger cities. The result is that in Christian Europe, a large proportion of believers in Christ love their neighbor only in relation to their own personality, but not in relation to their neighbor, because this person is of a different faith, a foreigner, or simply a stranger. The truth is that in the Christian world there is a poisonous mixture of pathologically stupid, selfish, primitive, and contemptible reflexes among many believers in Christ, which are directed against all human beings of other faiths, foreigners and foreigners. And since in Europe the Christian religion represents the actual religious power, and in this love of one's neighbor is only related to oneself and in the best case to one's own family, etc., as well as to Christian people of the same faith, a vicious resistance against living together with people of other faiths, foreigners, with immigrants, strangers, and every other kind of people is rampant among very many Christians throughout Europe, as also in the USA. But even the native neighbor comes into the field of resistance if he does not behave according to the meaning of what is demanded of him imperiously and selfishly by the other neighbor. So in the European Christian world, not only xenophobia, racial hatred and religious hatred go hand in hand with faith, but also hatred of native fellow human beings and neighbors, or even one's own family members, and so on. The whole thing is also taking on worse and worse forms, especially because more and more growing economic hardships are appearing, which are being nourished by Earth humans in Europe becoming more and more addicted to money, pleasure, and wealth, but not being sufficiently rewarded according to their views and their egoistic needs, while their employers and superiors are becoming millionaires many times over through horrendous and widely exaggerated rewards. The whole thing leads to popular discontent and to degenerations in the behavior of the populations, as a result of which many kinds of murders take place and discord and all kinds of malicious acts and deeds lead to mischief, as a result of which even exploitation, assassinations, theft, fraud, trafficking in human beings, prostitution, robbery, and suicide attacks, etc., appear. In Europe, especially in Germany, it has been common practice in the right-wing extremist scene for quite some time to frequently commit relevant violence against refugees and refugee homes, etc., as well as against asylum seekers. immigrants, and other foreigners. Violent confrontations between politically left-wing and right-wing, as well as various extreme groups, are also occurring more and more frequently and go beyond all dimensions of reason and rationality. The dangerous motives of these groups are not to be underestimated: malicious messages to the security policy and security organs of the states as well as to their populations, but also serious warnings that the extreme right-wing attacks and degenerations in Europe will continue up to anarchism if those in power do not finally relinquish their might and do not transfer it extensively to the people. With this desire and attitude, it is not only individuals with extreme anti-government views, but specifically certain groups with far-reaching connections, who direct their hatred against the governments, precisely with the aim of violently changing the government institutions according to their violent facon, in accordance with their ideological character. The next decisive question here is only whether a person acts alone and on his own, or as part of a group or the group as a whole, instigates mischief or carries it out in a dangerously violent manner and, under certain circumstances, snuffs out human lives or causes devastation. At the present time, the whole of Europe is too little vigilant and even lax and irresponsibly negligent in this respect, by which I do not only mean the populations of the individual states, but first and foremost the secret services and security organs, as well as the governments themselves. So it is not surprising that Europol, the supreme European police authority, irresponsibly claims that there is currently no right-wing extremist terrorism on the European continent due to ignorance of the effective reality. The EU dictators, the secret services and security organs, as well as the police authority, Europol, should give a lot of rational thought to all these facts. Because in the basic outlines, the criminal, paramilitary, and terrorist group formations have already been laid and are a reality, as has long been the case with the right-wing extremist scene.
The people in charge are self-important, power-obsessed and know-it-alls who do not let anyone tell them what to do. This is also the case with regard to the refugee system that exists today, which Angela Merkel has arrived. I hear this from many quarters again and again, as there is also much to be read about it in newspapers and on the internet, such as the following under source: Grüne Lebenslügen, warum Migration kein Menschenrecht sein kann.
Go to Germany. What criteria does a community use to decide whether to welcome a stranger? Is the one who has managed to enter the country illegally with the help of dubious smuggling gangs welcome? Or is it the one who, under the pretext of individual danger and with the help of legal proceedings, gains so much time that he obtains the legal title of toleration? Or is it the one who immediately and directly descends into illegality and criminality? It is not exaggerating that the author draws the logical conclusion that illegal immigration will then automatically become legal at some point. But where does that lead? The prime example for young intensive offenders from North African countries is NRW, especially Cologne and Dusseldorf. Entire districts are harassed, the police are powerless, toothless, and laughed at. Because these young people are used to completely different police officers, lawless areas are created but are not officially admitted. People talk about human rights in Morocco, for example. But nobody talks about the human rights of the citizens in Germany who suffer under the criminal NAFRAs. Morocco's youth problem. North Africans have been considered problem migrants not only since the Cologne New Year's Eve. One might think that these human beings are fleeing from poor Morocco to Europe in order to have a better life. But Morocco is not that poor. The country is rich in large phosphate deposits, which play a crucial role for the fertilizer industry. But this wealth, as in almost all undemocratic Islamic states, tends to benefit a small elite around the monarch, writes the correspondent of the Welt. He even thinks that this is why Morocco is one of the richest countries in the world. That is why it seems as if Morocco exports its hopeless problem youth benevolently into the German social system. Asylum law back then, it is absolutely clear that migration from dozens of countries, millions of whose youths often strive for Central Europe, cannot be permanently regulated by the right of asylum. To simply carry on as we did in the days when very few persecuted writers and tortured opposition politicians from the Third World sought asylum in Germany is nothing but hypocrisy. The problem had to be solved by means of an immigration law geared to German requirements and European needs. In the poor countries, the human beings would have understood this gap much better than all the green politicians. Otherwise, hundreds of thousands from the Maghreb, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Egypt, Somalia, Gabon, etc., would not throw away their passports and try to disguise themselves in our country as Syrians fleeing the war, the author points out. Sam,
I can fully solidarize with your opinion, your words, and the excerpts from the internet.
Short and to the point answer, thanks. Then something else. According to the early instructions of Quetzal, we have planted our center area with trees, bushes, shrubs, and many kinds of plants in such a way that our center practically consists of a forest area with many kinds of vegetation. The reason for this was to create an oxygen-rich environment, to be far away from civilization dust and civilization pollutants, which should have a better health effect on the center residents, as well as on the core group members who are often in the center and also work in the center compound. But the whole thing should also have an effect on the visitors, as it were. Can you say something about this on behalf of Quetzal?
Yes. The center area is at present so covered with trees, bushes, shrubs, and a very rich flora, as well as with a forest surrounding the center that, according to our calculations, all the trees, shrubs, etc. together filter about 360 tons of pollutants and dust out of the air per year, which are driven through the air by the winds from the valley, the villages, fields, and towns, etc. over the hills. Whereas in the villages and towns, the pollutants and dust particles largely remain trapped and thus very much pollute the air, in addition to exhaust gases and other harmful emissions that weaken the air and are breathed in by Earth humans, who thus fall ill with various ailments. The air in the center and center grounds is much purer. The result is that the air purity is much higher than in the villages, in the valley and lowlands as well as in the cities, since we have already measured good values in the center and center area, which were up to 85% and more higher than in the lowlands, the villages, and cities. This means that the trees, bushes, shrubs, and diverse plants in the center and center grounds actually produce a lot of fresh oxygen, which is breathed in by the center residents and by the core group members and visitors coming to the center and center grounds. On the one hand, this purer oxygen promotes physical as well as mental emotional well-being, which is also often mentioned by visitors, as I know how the fresh oxygen also promotes arterial elasticity and lung capacity. This means that the center residents and the core group members, as well as the visitors who come to the center, breathe and live much healthier in this place than all Earth humans in the lowlands, villages, and cities. The center and center grounds can be compared with the pure forest surrounding the center. Consequently, the vegetation of the center grounds also has the same oxygen-forming function as the entire forest around the center and center grounds.
Now I have a question regarding the Germanic New Medicine. Do you know anything more about it when you said the following on the 29th of October 2005 at the 402nd Official Contact Conversation, Pleiadian Contact Reports? Volume 10, page 246, sentence 34?
It is an absolutely inhuman swindle, lie and fraud, and an irresponsible charlatanry, through which many human beings find death because they believe the criminal machinations of this alleged healing medicine, which an irresponsible doctor makes his followers believe. The Germanic New Medicine, GNM, is effectively, as I said at the time, an irresponsible charlatanry that brings increasing terrible suffering and death to many Earth humans. The whole of this alleged medicine is based on fantasy. Lies and deceit of the founder and former doctor Reich Gerd Hamer, born the 17th of May, 1935 in Mettmann, Germany, who, as a former German doctor with a bad license to practice, has been propagating the dangerous Germanic New Medicine invented by him since 1981. His therapies are supposed to be an alternative to orthodox medicine, whereby Hamer suggestively spreads the stupid, false, and for sick Earth humans addicted to the Hamer delusion, life-threatening claim and lie that illnesses are only triggered by psychological conflicts and that these would disappear by applying and following the Germanic New Medicine. His false teaching in this respect further misleads that if the conflictual problems were resolved and ended, then the illnesses would also disappear. On the 8th of April, 1986, Hamer's German license to practice medicine was withdrawn as a result of continued illegal practice and fraud, and several arrest warrants were issued against him, as a result of which he was also imprisoned several times in Germany and France for his offenses. By 1995 alone, more than 80 deaths of persons had been registered in Germany and Austria. These cases were investigated by the authorities and showed that the deceased had demonstrably been treated personally by Hamer or had treated themselves on their own initiative according to his Germanic New Medicine until their death. Since then, however, many more deaths have occurred as a result of following the Germanic New Medicine, and according to our findings, several hundred Hamer believers have lost their lives as a result of the false Hameric medicine up to the present time. A fact which results from the fact that the nonsensical Hamer heresy has spread uncontrollably for the earthly authorities in Europe and even in non-European countries and has developed, so to speak, into a Germanic New Medicine delusion sect, about which there is no longer any overview for the authorities, etc. The purely fanciful and medically ineffective method of treatment, formerly called New Medicine, is very risky and poses a considerable danger to every patient's life and a license for inevitable death. Consequently, Hamer medicine is also connected with hundreds of deaths resulting from it and continuing to result from it, about which even the authorities, etc., have no knowledge whatsoever with regard to the whole extent. In truth, the Germanic New Medicine is absolutely ineffective and, moreover, is not a scientific medicine that would encompass the whole of medicine. Consequently, it is also not based on 5 empirically found biological laws of nature, as is mendaciously claimed by Hamer. It is also a lie and a fraud that the Germanic New Medicine is curative in every single case of a so-called disease in human beings. Animals, and plants in every single-celled living being and even in the entire cosmos. The whole of this sham medicine is based on fantastic dogmas, and effectively, as you are wont to say, on imbecilic hypotheses and false, mendacious statistical probabilities. This alleged medicine is in itself absolutely illogical and abnormal, and therefore also completely incomprehensible to any halfway intelligent human being. So no illnesses can be cured by this medicine. Consequently, illnesses do not run according to the imaginatively invented 5 biological laws of nature, according to which these are also not parts of a normally 2-phase, meaningful biological special program of nature, SBS, as Hamer imaginatively suggests to his believers. Hamer, who has often come into conflict with the law as a result of his life-threatening heresy of the Germanic New Medicine, acts completely without conscience and responsibility, and has in this way led hundreds and even thousands of Earth humans to turn away from orthodox medicine, as a result of which they have died or will also die in the future as a result of the application of the Germanic New Medicine, if they are in bondage to Hamer's heresy. No more and no less has a death cult come into being through the false doctrine of Hamer and his unthinking believers in the Germanic New Medicine, whose pathologically irresponsible and stubborn believers are unteachable. Consequently, the deaths will continue to increase through this false medicine, and Hamer's path will also be paved with corpses in the future, as you once said with regard to another matter. What has been said should be enlightening enough.
I think so too, thanks. What I want to say, however, is that the whole of Germanic New Medicine is called alternative medicine, which cannot be said in this way and is not correct, because it is effectively not an alternative medicine, but a deadly phantasm. A medicine can only be alternative if it is a complementary medicine, which is a collective term for different methods of treatment and diagnostic concepts, which sees itself as an alternative or supplement to conventional and scientifically founded methods of treatment. Alternative medicine, in the true sense of the word, is medicine that is to be understood as an alternative supplement to conventional medical treatment methods. This medicine must not be confused with natural medicine or naturopathy, which has a spectrum of different therapeutic measures and is oriented towards the body's own abilities for self-healing or spontaneous healing. In this respect, it prefers to use remedies or stimuli, etc., that occur in nature. But since you as a doctor are very well versed in these things, you could actually give a somewhat more detailed explanation.
I will comply with your wish and give the meaning and definition in the way I know the facts, which I have collected in the earthly and especially European area according to records, observations, and studies. Alternative medicine is also called alternative medicine and complementary medicine, which are collective names for different methods of treatment and diagnostic concepts. The actual alternative medical healing methods are very broad, although there is also a lot of charlatanry involved, and of course their modes of action cannot be scientifically proven, which is, however, undeniably the case with actual naturopathy. Effective alternative or complementary medicine, which is used in connection with orthodox medicine, is to be understood as a scientifically founded method of treatment and of course has nothing to do with charlatan alternative medicine, which stands outside what is taught in medical and psychology studies. Basically, in earthly medicine, these are healing methods that have been in use since ancient times, especially in the east of the earth, but have not found their way into traditional Western medicine. Nevertheless, alternative medicine is also known in the earthly Western Hemisphere, but not necessarily in medical circles, although it is supposed to promote conventional orthodox medicine, against which, however, there are always disputes. In certain circles, however, alternative healing methods are used to complement traditional Western therapies. And when the terms naturopathy and natural healing methods are mentioned, they refer to a spectrum of different medical and therapeutic measures that activate the body's own abilities for self-healing or spontaneous healing. However, not with the use of technological aids, but only in preference to naturally occurring means and stimuli, such as breathing, movement of the body, the earth, thoughts and feelings, cold, light, air, and food, as well as rest and solar radiation, as well as understanding and reason, warmth, water, and the processes of the will. In this broader understanding, all natural remedies are also included, especially any medicinal plants that are processed into useful and valuable medicines through certain preparations. The whole definition is somewhat problematic, because as Hamer's web of deceit and lies regarding the Germanic New Medicine proves, many things are included in alternative medicine that effectively cannot be called such, and also have nothing to do with naturopathy and natural medicine. Excluded from any alternative medicine are especially vaccinations with genetically engineered vaccines that have a preventive effect by activating the body's own immune system. Neither the nonsensical Germanic New Medicine nor vaccinations with genetically engineered vaccines belong to effective alternative medicine and naturopathy. So they are not included in the definition criteria. In naturopathy, only a few areas are usually called alternative medicine in the sense that they work alternatively or complementarily with natural remedies. As a rule, Useful parts of complementary medicine are not scientifically recognized in the narrower sense in earthly orthodox medicine, although they form complementary and useful procedures to orthodox medicine. Earthly naturopathy generally includes the following natural healing methods: movement therapy or therapy through systematic active or passive movement of the body or individual limbs; balneotherapy or balneology, which includes the science of baths or the medical therapeutic application of natural healing springs and healing gases, as well as peloids in the form of healing mud baths, as well as internal applications such as drinking cures with healing waters and inhalations. Dietetics or dietology, which as a collective term includes all measures that contribute to the maintenance of the health of the body and psyche or to the healing of physical as well as psychological ailments, whereby a regular way of life is also to be cultivated, brought about, and maintained. Hydrotherapy, which uses the therapeutic use of water applications in the form of hot and cold water to alleviate and cure acute and chronic diseases and conditions. Nutritional therapy means consciously eating good and correct food, as this supports the body's entire organism on the path to greater health, its maintenance, and well-being. Because only a balanced diet provides the body and all its organs with the vital and nutritious substances they need. A healthy and correct diet is not only a support for the preservation of the body, because basically a healthy diet also preserves the consciousness, thoughts, and feelings, as well as a contented psychological state. Furthermore, a healthy and correct diet is also of importance for a cure of diseases or illnesses, because a cure depends on an adapted and valuable diet. Order therapy is based as a health teaching in the principles of the order of life, and thus in the shaping of all areas of life that are necessary for the maintenance or restoration of holistic health. The whole comprises a structuring of the outer and inner order of life, because this influences the consciousness and the psyche as well as the health of the whole organism of the body in a positive way. Phytotherapy forms the center of the development and functioning of the locomotor system, as well as the interplay of all areas of motor and sensory functions, and consequently it includes all functions and parts of the human organism, because these are related to the whole locomotor system. For example, the joints, the cardiovascular system, the musculature, the nervous system, as it also includes the psyche, etc., as well as the use of active plant substances.
Thanks for your comments, but what about pseudoscientific alternative medicine?
What is to be called actual pseudoscientific alternative medicine and has nothing to do with effective alternative supplementary medicine and effective naturopathy, but is nevertheless incorrectly called naturopathic, and is also practiced in this way with corresponding alternative medicine remedies, is very diverse. This is because, since time immemorial, Earth humans have used an incalculable number of alternative methods, which have been applied uncontrollably and are still being applied today, although many deaths have occurred as a result and many human lives are also still being claimed. In modern times, however, various alternative medicine systems known throughout the world are in use on Earth, whereby the remedies in question are forms of therapy based on methods that cannot be described as natural or purely naturopathic. Specifically, they can also in no way be described as orthodox medicine. Various of these alternative medicine methods are completely misleading, ineffective in terms of healing, and are only based on the hope that uninformed delusional believers in these methods will develop effective self-healing powers and thereby become healthy or seemingly healthy. Various such methods also involve confused anthroposophical, esoteric, cosmic, religious, sectarian, and theosophical imaginings and delusions, as well as the belief in miracles and miraculous powers with regard to healing methods, etc. As an example, I can list the following well-known alternative medicine methods and therapies, which are advocated and used all over the world, whereby in relation to one or the other method, self-healing naturally takes place through delusional forces, Aromatherapy, by means of an aromatic scent that appeals to human beings, produces a mood-lifting increase in their thoughts and feelings, and thus in their state of mind, causing a consciousness, psychic, and physical sense of well-being. Homeopathy is a procedure in which diseases and ailments are treated with highly diluted remedies which, in larger quantities, cause similar or identical symptoms of disease or suffering in healthy human beings. The dilutions in high potency are so massive that there is no active ingredient left in the remedy, which is why in the best case one can only speak of a signal effect if there is a reaction. Spagyric. According to the spagyric claim, every substance is supposed to have a pure and good principle, but the whole is also supposed to have a hostile principle that resists it. This assumption prompted the spagyricists early on to separate the evil from the good and the fine from the coarse, the spiritual from the material as well as the poisonous from the salutary, by means of a supposedly suitable procedure, as interpreted by Ars Spagyrica, from which the term spagyric arose. Bach flower therapy. This system comprises 38 plants native to England, the extracts of which are supposed to cure human beings of diseases and ailments, as claimed on the one hand by Bach flower therapy advocates, but denied by other adherents of this therapy in the way that Bach flower therapy cannot cure physical diseases and ailments, and especially not if organ damage is already present. The causes of the many physical illnesses and ailments are said to lie, similar to the life-threatening and ineffective Germanic New Medicine in mental disharmonies, negative states of mind, and in negative states of mind. The devout proponents claim that plant extracts would help human beings and not simply combat and eliminate symptoms, but that the effect of flower essences is supposed to have a healing effect. Bach flower therapy, as a healing procedure, is said to both alleviate momentary negative feelings and moods, and also exert a positive influence on character over a longer period of time. Furthermore, the influence of the Bach flowers is said to be harmonizing, but also to prevent illnesses and also to support the healing process of already existing complaints. Traditional Chinese medicine. Chinese medicine has a long tradition, the roots of which go back some 6,000 years, although the current foundations of traditional Chinese medicine (TCM) have emerged as a system of medicine in more recent China over the last 2,500 years. Important in this system is the interplay of acupuncture, drug therapy, exercise, nutrition, and tuina massage, which are considered to be the most important treatment factors for illness and disease. Contrary to the somatic or disease-related and microscopic and thus detail-oriented approach of Western medicine, TCM represents a functional medicine that is considered holistic, as is of course usually claimed for all forms. This TCM method states that the health of every human being depends on a balance between the opposing forces of yin and yang. Thus, if yin and yang remain in balance, the body and mind are healthy. However, if one of the forces is overly stressed or simply too weak due to some circumstance, then this will lead to imbalance and thus illness and disease. The interaction of yin and yang, of cold and warm, of passive and active is supposed to create a kind of life energy called qi, which is supposed to flow on clearly recognizable paths, on the so-called meridians or pathways, which are supposed to connect all regions and parts of the body with each other. Yin and yang, like qi, must be in harmony, and as long as qi can flow freely in sufficient quantities throughout the body, the human being is physically and psychologically healthy. If the qi flows are disturbed, diseases will be caused, which is why the main aim of treatment is always to balance yin and yang, as well as to ensure a free qi circulation. Ayurvedic medicine is borrowed from the Indian Sanskrit terms ayus life and Veda knowledge, the word Ayurveda meaning life wisdom or life science, which is a combination of experiential values and philosophy that focuses on human health, illness, and disease, important emotional thought, feeling, mental, physical, and spiritual aspects. The typology speaks of the so-called doshas or bioenergies influencing the body, or of different temperaments or life energies, or of three bioenergetic regulatory systems, which are called Vata, Pitta, and Kapha in Ayurveda, and are called doshas in Sanskrit, which prevail in nature and in the universe, and also have their own interplay in all and every single living being. These regulatory systems are called as follows. Movement principle, Vata equal sign ether, air, Pneuma, wind metabolic principle, fire principle, Pitta equal sign bile, fire, water, structural principle, Kapha equal sign, earth, water, phlegm. According to Ayurvedic conception, the doshas are present in every organism, whereby usually one or two doshas dominate, rarely all three. If an organism is healthy, then these energies or temperaments must be in a balanced, harmonious equilibrium. For a treating doctor, it must be important to know which doshas predominate in a human being to be treated, because each type of doshas requires different treatments and medicines. And in addition, the current relationship of the doshas to each other must also be determined by means of a pulse diagnosis, Nadivigyan. This also includes determining how the doshas should relate to each other, which is derived from the patient's astrological horoscope Prakriti analysis. In addition, in order to restore the right balance, accumulated waste products must be eliminated, for which certain purification procedures, panchakarma, are used. But the whole process also includes bloodletting and medicines of many Ayurvedic forms, as well as breathing exercises, baths, enemas, vomiting, color therapy and fasting, massages, yoga therapy, and music therapy. Anthroposophic medicine is grounded in a worldwide and very confusing spiritual esoteric worldview and its associated training and cognitive pathways. Anthroposophy is an attempt to combine elements of German idealism, the worldview of Goethe, and the gnosis of Far Eastern teachings with the scientific insights of Steiner. An application of the idea of evolution in relation to spiritual development forms a central aspect of this. Steiner took for his anthroposophy evolutionary approaches of the Darwinist Haeckel, as well as especially from the modern theosophy of Helena Blavatsky. In contrast to representatives of a purely secular, scientifically oriented idea of progress. Understanding humanity and its development spiritually and supersensibly, anthroposophy sets itself apart from theosophy proper and its Eastern religious orientation. Anthroposophy includes evolution, as well as a new interpretation of evolution, which led to extensive controversies about possible social, Darwinist, and racist aspects at the time when the anthroposophical system first came into being. According to the unreal understanding of the founder Rudolf Steiner, anthroposophical medicine is based on confused esoteric principles of natural science and on anthroposophical spiritual science, as well as on research into the phenomena of the physical, the living, the soul, and the spiritual, which, realistically speaking, raises more questions than real knowledge. With regard to anthroposophical research, extensions of knowledge through higher forms of knowledge are also declared to be indispensable, which are considered to be causally effective in the above-mentioned phenomena through four members of the being of the human being, namely astral body, etheric body, physical body, and eye organization. Similar to the Germanic New Medicine and the Bach flower therapy, etc., illnesses and suffering are said to arise from the disharmony of the elements. Anthroposophical medical therapies are used to find a new balance by overcoming illness and suffering. Anthroposophical medicine includes various therapies, such as eurythmy therapy or movement therapy, which are intended to have a holistic effect on the human being in such a way that he is able to express himself correctly in his body, as well as in his social environment and in his gestures. Other therapies include color therapy and mistletoe therapy, which are used to treat cancer, as well as rhythmic massage according to Ita Wegman, and curative applications of artistic processes in various fields of art, such as painting therapy, music therapy and sculpture, etc. Through all anthroposophical therapies, especially eurythmy therapy, the laws that exist equally in human beings and in the cosmos are to be brought into harmony, and thus also one's own life and self-healing powers are to be strengthened.
Thanks also for these remarks. In my opinion, the pure and correct natural remedies have a so-called holistic approach, and also a holistic medicine, by which I mean that effectively good. Pure and correct natural remedies, when applied correctly and in the right measure, are able to bring one or even every disturbed harmony of the human organism back into balance. I also think that genuine natural remedies can claim to treat not only the body or the entire organism, but also the consciousness and the psyche, which are also to be included in the overall condition of the body. This is precisely because thoughts, feelings, and the psyche, as well as the consciousness and the whole body, interact and react to each other. So if the organism and thus the body is all round healthy, full of energy and strength, then this also has an effect on the thoughts, feelings, psyche, consciousness, as is also the case in the opposite way.
That is consistent with our scientific knowledge and experience.
But the actual pseudoscientific alternative medicine, as I understand the whole thing, is not founded on a reproducible basis that provides results, but ultimately only on a false, erroneous, and confused fantasy doctrine.
Yes, that is so. But now I have the following to discuss with you in private, after which I must leave. It concerns